Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, Yuko. I'm very happy to be able to give this workshop to you. And I'm also happy to see a lot of new faces here. And of course, we are always happy to see familiar faces. So thank you very much for joining us today. Today, I'm hoping to have a conversation with you about assessment in general, and also in particular about assessment, about how to use assessment in support of students' learning. Okay, so before we start talking about that, given that we have a few new people, actually quite a bit of new people here. I'm just going to introduce myself and give you guys my background so that you can sort of put this workshop in a bigger kind of context. So right now, this is actually a new logo that we just created for GFD, and we really like it. So I'm a member of Global Faculty Development here at Todai, at the University of Tokyo. And so basically what we do is to offer workshops like this, organize workshops like this, and now we are also working on designing a website so that we can disseminate information related to global faculty development and things like that. So that's mainly what I'm doing here at the University of Tokyo. And also, as a part-time instructor, I'm teaching business English elsewhere at another university, and that's going to be important today. So I'll just mention that. So before that, prior to coming here, like Yuko mentioned, I was a PhD student at Georgetown University, and there I specialized in assessment, language pedagogy, and program evaluation. So basically, I'm mainly coming from second language education perspectives, yeah. And also prior to that, I was a student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa as well. And both of these two universities in the US, I taught Japanese, and also I taught some content courses to train language teachers as well. So that's the kind of background that I have. And with that, so basically that's about me, and now I want to give you some time to get to know each other and also talk about assessment a little bit to begin with. So there are two questions that I want you to think about as a start. So the first question is, what assessment activities have you used in educational settings, and also for what purposes? And so before you start talking about these two questions, please introduce yourselves if you don't know each other, so that you know where everybody's coming from. Yeah. Okay. So let's spend maybe 1 minute, 1 to 2 minutes. Okay. Is it too short? Oh, okay. 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so you might not have finished discussing, but that's okay. So can you please share what you have talked about in your group to the whole group? Any volunteers?
The thing that I did, so I was teaching a PE class this semester, and then in lieu of like a laboratory component that would complement the class, since it was primarily lecture-based, I used some software that the students could digitally manipulate DNA and use that to allow them to apply what they learned in the lecture. It's sort of a real-world situation.
Okay, so maybe, okay, let's see, use software. Virtual lab. To assess students' ability to, this is going to be very long. Whether they can apply their knowledge, right? Okay. To the real world. Okay. So that's good. Anything else? Anything else that you use in your classrooms?
In our group, like a couple of people mentioned peer review.
Okay, peer review. Yeah. That's easy to write. No summary needed. Anything else? Self-reflection, okay. Anything else? What about like exams? I thought that might come up, but
Multiple choice exams.
multiple choice exams, yeah. Papers, yeah, reports. Quizzes, yeah. Okay, so, well, as we can see already here, there are a lot of different assessment activities that we could use in the classroom, right? And you probably talked about what kind of purposes all of these assessments have. And they probably have different purposes, right? So what kind of purposes came up when you were talking about this?
So I was asked why do we grade students' papers. We have students, unless we have students write a scientific paper, it's worth 50% of their total grade.
Okay.
So why do we do this? And the reason is obviously that they want to be scientists in the future, learning that. So it's getting them ready for their future.
Okay, good. So that's basically you're giving the assignment to help them learn the kind of skills that they will need in the future, yeah. Anything else? Yeah, sorry.
We have to give them grades.
Yes, to give them grades. No, it is important, right? Give them grades. Anything else?
Help them to develop abilities.
Hmm?
Help them to develop different abilities.
Okay, so help them develop different abilities, help them, so maybe let's put that here, yeah. Anything else?
Content knowledge.
Content knowledge, okay, help them learn content knowledge. Skills, yeah.
But there's some subtle differences there. It's to assess, it's not to help them learn content knowledge, it's to check that they have learned.
Okay,
Not the same thing.
okay, so to check.
I mean, you're assessing whether, the same with this one, is to assess whether they've developed a skill or a particular ability, right? I think you can do both, but it's not necessarily the same thing, right?
Right. Okay, so we can help them learn through assessment, or we can also check whether students have learned a new concept, yeah. Okay, so that's good. So just to summarize, there are different purposes that we can come up with, right? And the first one that I have is to give grades. And we can also motivate students by giving not necessarily easy, but doable kind of assessment tasks. And if we think about assessment in a more broader term, we use assessment to place students into the right level. We screen students before they come into the university, for example. And also, if we think about English language proficiency, we can measure students' proficiency with an assessment as well. And lastly, we can also support students' learning. And there are, all of these purposes are legitimate and good, but today what we're going to focus on in this assessment is how do we go about using assessment to support students' learning. So basically, this is the focus of today's workshop, yeah? Okay, so then the question is, how can we use assessment in support of students' learning? And there are a lot of different ways to go about it, but there are 3 principles of a learning-oriented assessment. One is that the first thing we want to do is to share learning expectations with the students. The second principle is to elicit and interpret evidence of learning. And lastly, we always want to provide meaningful feedback to the students. And we're going to look at these three principles in turn in more detail. Okay, so here I think it would be helpful for us to sort of have an example to think about. So I said, like I said in the introduction, I teach business English at another university. So I think it will be useful for us to think about that. So let's say, just for now, that we want the students to be able to give an effective business presentation. That's what we want our students to be able to do. And we want to use assessment to help them achieve this goal. Okay, so then as experts, we know what makes a good kind of presentation. There are a lot of things to pay attention to, but it's not necessarily the case that students share that same understanding. So we want to tell the students what we know and what we expect them to be able to do. So then how can we share our learning expectations with the students? How do we share with the students what we expect them to do? We can share our learning expectations in the form of student learning outcomes in the syllabus. So that's basically what we do at the beginning of the semester, maybe in broad kind of vague terms. And also, if we go back to our example of giving an effective business presentation, maybe we can give them a model, right? And alternatively, if we want this sharing activity to be maximally supportive of students' learning, what we can do is to be very, very specific, right? So we can give students assessment rubrics, yeah. So this last one, assessment rubrics, I want to spend some time on that today. So here, assessment rubrics are very, very important to support students' learning, and that's because assessment rubrics help students and actually teachers alike understand what the activity at hand entails and what's expected of the students, what needs to be focused on and paid attention to in performance, and also what performance quality is valued. And all of these things are expressed in more concrete and analytic terms than, for example, giving a model. So we can give a good model of a business presentation, but that's very, very holistic. Yeah. So it's hard for the students to sort of understand what's actually good. So, but assessment rubrics can actually extrapolate these things in a more concrete and analytic terms. Okay. Then, enough talking from me. So we're going to look at one sample assessment rubric, and here's what I want you to do. So I want you to look at the assessment rubric and think about, or actually identify components that this assessment rubric includes. So it's components, right? Oh, wait. So, sorry, on the page that says Presentation Performance Assessment Rubric A, that's what I would like you to look at. And just think about what are some components that rubric has. Like overarching kind of, components. So there's a word that I really want to use, but that's one of the answers, so I don't want to. So you see some components. You see some, you see numbers, right? You see numbers. So maybe can you label those numbers? So what are they? What are these numbers? Sorry, what are these numbers? And then whatever you have on the left-hand side, what are they? Okay, so we'll do more work on that. So maybe we'll move on for now. Okay, so what kind of components? What do you see? I don't know. What do you see? What do you see?
Words and numbers.
Words and numbers, yes. What are these numbers? Right, so there are some kind of scores, scales, ratings, right? Let's call it scales for now. And what are these? How to get the points, yes. So categories, yeah, these are the categories, right? So basically, that's what we have, categories and scales. And the question that I have for you is that how useful is this assessment rubric for you?
This one?
Yes.
This actual one?
That one you have in front of you. How useful?
Not so useful.
Not so useful. Why?
The categories are a bit arbitrary and there's not enough variety in the spec.
Okay, so the categories themselves are not, they don't necessarily match your expectations or what, okay. Lindsay?
It's also interesting that the first 5 are very subjective. Is the product idea interesting? How much thought went into planning? Is the product, that's very subjective. The last 2 would be fairly easy to concretely evaluate, but the first 5 are pretty subjective.
Okay. Anything else?
Also, the scales that will be refined, how you actually, what one actually mean.
Right. Okay. So that's the point that I wanted to get at actually. So when you see this kind of rubric, and when you see 0, 1, 2, and if they are scores, you know that 0 is lower than 2, but you don't necessarily know what 2 for our presenters prepared. We don't really know what 2 means, or as learners, they don't necessarily know what that means. Or maybe they know what that means, but 1, something in the middle, it's really hard for them to understand, right? So what we want then, what a good kind of assessment rubrics have is descriptions. So descriptions for each of the cells, right? So these are supposed to have descriptions. Yes?
In that rubric is the relative evaluation or absolute evaluation.
So if we have descriptions, it doesn't have to be relative.
Okay, but
It doesn't have to be relevant.
Yeah.
If you have description.
If it included more descriptions.
Yeah, but I don't think the relative. Yes, if you adopt the relative evaluation, so I need to more information in the group. Yeah, because it is very, very simple, too simple.
Right. So what we need is, we want to understand what 0 means, what 1 means, right? And what 2 means, yeah. Okay, so then, so maybe let's compare it with this one with actual descriptions. Okay, so we can use assessment rubrics for different purposes, and we can, so the students can use this rubric to assess each other. They can do that too, but that one I actually use in my business English class, and that one I use for my own kind of purposes. And the students get easier version of that because it's just too much for them to read. But they do get that before they actually perform the business presentation, so that they know on what kind of criteria they are graded.
The classroom evaluation is always the English class, right? So you're talking about the English.
Right, yeah. And that's because it's going all over the place, but that's okay. That's okay. So in my current English class, because they're advanced English learners, I'm focusing more on their skills to be able to do things in English. So you have a lot of skill-based kind of criteria there, yeah. Okay, so, all right, so it looks more helpful, right, from the teacher's perspectives and also students' perspectives to have descriptions for each of the cells. Yeah. Okay. So with that in mind, so now that we have created this kind of assessment rubrics, we have to do something with it. We can't just leave it there. It's a waste of time. So what do we do with this assessment rubric? Like I started talking about, we are going to share it. We want to share this with our students so that students will know on what basis they're graded, their performance is graded. Yeah. And when they prepare to do this presentation, for example, they know what kind of areas to focus on, and in performance as well, they know exactly what they should focus on. So that's what assessment rubrics help students to do. And for that purpose, we want to share this kind of assessment rubrics with the students before they actually do the presentation. Okay, so then so assessment rubrics, in nature, it's an assessment tool. But if we share them with the students beforehand, before they actually do the performance, we can also use it as a learning tool for the students. Okay. So now that we have assessment rubrics, yes, Johnny.
Are you finished on assessment rubrics?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, just one comment.
Okay.
Really, because if you want to use assessment rubrics for learning, you can go a step further too, right? So you can, in advance, ask students to develop rubrics.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you ask them to think in advance about if you were going to assess these presentations, how would you write your rubric? And then you can get them to assess each other's rubrics, then it's even a stage more into thinking.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
If that's the purpose for learning.
Right. No, that's a perfect example of how we can help students develop assessment literacy, right? So once they go out in the real world, I can't go with them, right? So they will have to figure out how to survive in the real world. And, their boss is not going to tell them, I'm going to grade your performance on this and that. So they'll have to be able to figure that out. So that's a great example, yeah. Yes? Yeah, sure, yeah. Okay.
Maybe, it is helpful beforehand to give the student this result. But student, it's not really concrete, so that the student cannot do some student cannot do what to do with this. I should make an interesting, presentation. But what interest is, so they should know, in concrete, how do support the student by enhancing their...
The story doesn't end here, right? So this is just a part of how we can scaffold the students to be able to do the final task. Yeah. So maybe in class we can talk about exactly what you're saying. We can talk about, so what do you think makes business kind of presentation interesting? How do we, what kind of elements do you want to include in your presentation so that, your audience won't be sleeping while you're giving a presentation? So I think we can discuss these things in class as well. Any other questions at this point? Maybe we'll have, hopefully, we can have a Q&A session at the end as well. Yeah. Okay, all right, so then now that we have, this kind of assessment rubric, we want to use this. If we can't use this, what are we going to do? So then what we want to do is to elicit students' performance somehow so that we can interpret their performance and learn from it. Right. So how do we elicit performance? Well, if you go back to the example of giving a business presentation, for example, we can simply say, go and give an effective proposal presentation, and it's possible that that's the only kind of instruction that you get before this assessment task. Or we can also give them a detailed kind of task description if we want to help them learn and become able to be able to achieve this final task of giving a presentation. So just for your information, at the back of the first handout that I gave you, there's a task description that I use with my students in the business English course. So that's the kind of task description they get before, well, in class before they do the actual performance. And alternatively, if what we are trying to have the students to be able to do is a lot bigger kind of task, like to have them write a research paper, we can also divide this really big task that the students may be intimidated by doing by themselves. We can divide them into different parts, and now we have a series of assessment activities to help them to get to the final goal of being able to write a research paper on their own. So, assessment activity doesn't just have to be one, and it doesn't have to exist, there on its own, but we can use a series of them to help them achieve a goal. Okay, before we move on to how we might go about interpreting the evidence of learning, I just want to summarize what we have been talking about by saying that how we design assessment tasks is important. It matters because well-designed tasks elicit performance that reveals students learning more effectively, and also they help students learn further, so they are learning oriented. Okay. So then, let's say that we have this student's performance to deal with. Students have done their presentations, or they have submitted the essay report. What do we do with this? We need to interpret it somehow. So how do we interpret or score students' performance? Any ideas? How do we do it? We go back somewhere. Yep, exactly. So we go back to the assessment rubrics, right? That's where we basically started. And then, so let's say that we have scored students' performances by using this rubric, right? So then, what do we know? What do we know from the students' scores? So here, the question that I want you to think about is, what can we infer or extrapolate from students' performances on a given task? Is this question vague? It is, okay. So let's say that one student did really poorly when he gave a presentation. He just, didn't look at the audience. He was just reading like this. So that's one person. And the next person, she did really well. She made really good eye contact and performed really well. There are differences, right? So what can we extrapolate from this? What can we infer from that? Yeah, Lindsay.
I think this is a key question all the time, which is that I want to infer if someone did well that I taught them well, and if they did badly that I didn't teach them well or that they didn't absorb what was learned. But I think the reality is, more often than not, what I can infer is that person was already good at the task, and so if they did really well, then they're good at giving presentations, and if they did poorly, then they're not good at giving presentations. So the question is, how much do I infer, their absorption and learning of the materials, and how much of it is just their state of being before they came to the class.
Okay, so maybe it's overlapping, but there are two things that we can find out, right? So one is about the students. We can learn about the students themselves. And also we can learn about our teaching. We can learn about how our teaching is going. Maybe it's hard to disarticulate these two, but maybe these two areas. Anything else?
The student's background. So all students aren't equal. So they come here with different skills, etc. So you can say some students will ace it, some will fail. Not because of the teaching or the material, it's just they're not able. You just don't have, they're missing so many different other parts.
Okay.
You can't put it together.
So we can learn about the students and also maybe not necessarily what they have learned in the classroom, but what they brought into the classroom. Yeah. Anything else? Can we learn about anything else by looking at?
Yeah, about the tasks.
Ah, interesting.
Tasks appropriate.
Right. Okay. So the other thing that we can learn by looking at students' performance is to think about whether this task was actually appropriate for the students, and also whether the rubric, the assessment rubrics that you had, whether this worked in a fair, consistent manner. So that's another thing that we can learn from it, right? Okay. All right. So now then, so if we focus on the students, so now for us, we know not necessarily what they have learned in the classroom maybe, but we know what they can do, what they cannot do, what they need to improve on, right? So we know that. They don't necessarily know that, right? So we need to tell them how well they did or what they need to work on. So that's the next stage of learning-oriented assessment. So we want to provide meaningful kind of feedback. So I have to say, learning does happen through activities that we have planned so far. So by sharing our expectations through assessment rubrics, and also giving detailed kind of task descriptions and having students actually do stuff, do the task. It does, learning does happen through these activities, but what research shows or suggests is that without feedback, learning is less effective and usually less complete. And there is a very famous meta-analysis by Hattie, and feedback actually is one of the 10 key features of effective learning or teaching. So then what we need to think about is any kind of feedback okay? Or maybe some are more meaningful or relevant to the students than others, right? So how do we make feedback meaningful? Well, there are four things that, well, there are a lot of things, but there are four things that we want to be careful of in particular. And one, I would say that we want to be focused when we give students feedback, right? So coming from a language teaching background, I used to do this too, so I don't mean to blame anybody, but the kind of typical mistake that a novice language teacher makes is to correct every single mistake that the student makes, right? So then the student gets this really red paper and then he's just overwhelmed and he's not going to learn from it, right? So if we want this assessment to be maximally supportive of students' learning, we want to be focused. We want to find patterns. So in other words, we don't have to correct every single mistake that they make. We also want to be timely in giving feedback. So usually the immediate feedback is better and more effective than delayed feedback. Yeah. So we want to give feedback while their memory is fresh, of course. And then I really like this quote, so I'm just going to read it. But feedback acts like a GPS telling them how close they are to the target and what steps they can take to reach it. So, we want to be able to offer guidance on where to go next. We want to be concrete about this. And lastly, I think this is I might say this is most important of all the four. And that is, we want to think about how we can give students a chance to act on feedback. So we can spend hours and hours giving students feedback, but if they're not going to look at it, if they're not going to buy into it, it's just going to be a waste of time, right? So we want to make sure that students have some kind of reasons to incorporate feedback into their learning or into their work. Right. So then I want to hear your ideas on this. So how do you think we can make learning happen through feedback? So what kind of activities or strategies can we use to make sure that students will pay attention to the feedback that you give and they will incorporate it into maybe the next work or the work that they're currently working on? So maybe have a chat with your group members. Okay, it's nice to hear a heated discussion. But maybe can we share our ideas with the whole group? Any ideas that you would like to share with us? Yes.
So I was thinking that the first thing is not to wait too much to make the feedback, because if you wait too much, that's what goes fast something else.
Okay.
And one thing I like to do with the student when they make some presentation or writing stuff is to make some collaboration activities to have feedback about what we did by making a group like this with a leader, but not this leader will be not the only person to talk. You will have to ask everybody and let everybody talk. And we share and we make a correction together, and then we can have feedback by the discussion, and they can learn from each other.
Okay, so after some kind of a performance or writing, students will get together and talk about how well they think they did. And
about different mistakes too.
okay, and they can talk about different kinds of mistakes or similar kind of mistakes that they made, and also maybe how to improve their work as well. Yeah, that's a very interesting technique. Yeah, that we can use in the classroom. Yeah. Anything else?
I think it's important to make revision and redoing a part of the process, so that in the middle of the semester they get feedback either from peer review or from the professor, and then they can actually use that feedback to turn to the second draft. And then you can really assess how much they have taken the feedback to heart.
Right, exactly. So the idea is that we don't give feedback just at the end of the semester, but we keep doing it so that the students have chance to actually use the feedback to improve their work. Yeah, very good. Any other ideas, Johnny?
One idea is, before you give the feedback, you ask the students to assess how they think they've done. So that they've already kind of primed their brain to think. So there'll be some things where, as one student will say, I think I did this badly, and you'll be saying, yes, actually you did. But there'll be other things where the student might think they've done something quite well, and will be quite surprised when they're faced with the fact that what they thought they did well, they haven't done well, and they will psychologically respond much more strongly to that and take it more to heart. So I think by setting their own internal baseline before you feed back to them, you can make it kind of more effective.
Right, yeah. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but you, as a teacher, we don't have to be the only one to give feedback, right? So the students can assess themselves, and in this case, that would help them understand or take in the kind of feedback that they get from the teacher, yeah. Good. Any other ideas or anything else that you use in your classroom? Yuko?
I was talking about maybe having the students reflect on their own work and just like write a journal or diary how they do, so like a portfolio. It's a writing assessment that you're doing.
So that like self-reflection of their own writing process, maybe?
Yes.
Okay, nice. So and then they're going to include it in the portfolio, learning portfolio. Yeah, nice.
And so some students cannot differentiate the personal assessment and the work assessment, the product assessment. So then I clearly say this is not personal one. I just evaluate what you have done. So at the beginning of the process, I really differentiate that.
So that's when you give the feedback?
Beginning of the process, I'm always doing it. I usually do that. If you say that 2-3 times in the beginning of the process,
Right.
I understand.
Right, okay. And that would probably help when the students evaluate each other as well, right? So just don't evaluate this person, but evaluate their work, yeah, right. Sorry, yes.
Yes, in connection to setting the mood in the classroom, because I do also peer evaluation, before I do the peer evaluation, I will tell specifically the class that when you receive a lot of comments from your peer, it is not ichime. It's not bullying. They are actually helping you, but if you don't receive any feedback, that is bullying. So they become more eager in giving those feedback. So because they feel that they are helping their classmates improve their work.
I think it's also along those lines, it's important for all peer review to be highly structured and for there to be specific questions for the students to answer at specific peer review tasks. It should never ever be just, what do you think of this? And I think that puts them at ease because then they know exactly what they're being asked to evaluate. They know they're not being asked to say anything personal. They're just being asked some basic questions about the content and the structure of the writing.
Right, yeah, exactly. And just going back to the assessment rubric that we looked at, maybe, it also helps the students to know when they evaluate each other what kind of aspects to look at and what kind of aspects to comment on, like Lindsay said. Yeah, okay. So yes?
Question.
Yes.
Maybe we can talk about this later. How much feedback is good feedback?
That's how much questions. These are hard.
I asked because I feel really mortified because I don't really give feedback until the very end of the semester, and now I realize my students are probably not being compensated. But during the semester, how much feedback is like how frequency or quality or?
So the thing to do is at one time we don't want to give students too much feedback because then it's not really focused, right? We're going to just talk about every single areas that we could talk about, and the students will just get overwhelmed. So I think it's good to have a focus each time, right? So if they are working on some kind of writing task, maybe focus on the structures for when they just start writing, right? And then gradually maybe we can move on to like language aspects and things like that. So I think we need to have some kind of a focus when we give feedback. And I would say that we don't want to give students feedback in every class. Well, we do in a way, but we don't want to do too many assessment activities, right? It's just too much work for us and too much work for them. So it's hard to say like numbers, but in the business English class, I do 4 assessment activities in one semester. So in a way, that's the number of feedback that they get. And they get this kind of feedback continuously throughout the semester. But maybe it's interesting. Yeah, Diego, did you have anything? Yeah.
Actually, I don't have experience at teaching, but it's just a thought that I have. But like feedback for me is something that is really related to motivation, actually. So having feedback is something that works with the motivation of the student. So I was wondering if like this idea of motivating the student can be used as a criteria to think about how much feedback we need to give to a student, because depending on the background of the student, if you have a first-year student or like a master's PhD student, probably the amount of motivation that this person needs
Right, yeah. No, that's a good point. So one thing is motivation. The other thing probably is the ability levels or proficiency levels. So depending on the kind of ability levels, the frequency and the amount of feedback that we should give changes, right? Yeah, so that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you. It wasn't really a good question. Sorry, it wasn't a good answer for your question, but sorry. Maybe we'll come back to the question. Yeah. Okay. So then you said all these, you shared all these ideas with us, so I don't really have to say this. But one thing I like to do is to give students what I call pre-feedback. So I give students feedback on their presentation slides before they give a presentation, so that I know that they're not going to fail horribly, and also they can incorporate the kind of feedback that I give them. We can give another chance to give a presentation. If it's a writing kind of task, we can give feedback on their drafts, and at each stage of writing, and set the final goal as writing a whole research paper and possibly to be published, like the Alessa people are doing. Yeah. And also, we can always give another similar writing task, maybe not in the same course, but if we think about it in a longer term, that's what we want to do. Okay. Now then, so the last question that I want us to think about is who gives feedback, and we already started talking about this, right? So the teacher, as a teacher, we give students feedback, right? And like you were saying, peer feedback, so the students can give feedback to each other. And also students themselves, they can reflect on their own work. Anybody else comes to your mind who may be able to give students feedback? TAs, oh, okay, yeah, TAs. Somewhere between teacher and peer, maybe? TA, I forgot about that. TA? Anybody else? Visitors, yes. I learned recently that you're not really, I don't know, this idea might be hard to actually realize in this context, but it's a really common thing to have an expert other to give students feedback, especially in foreign language classrooms in the US. It's a really typical thing to do. So all of these different types of feedback, they have different purposes or different they achieve different goals, right? So as a teacher, we want to give strategic feedback focusing on what students need to work on next. And we try to give trustworthy and accurate kind of feedback. And we want the students to reflect on their own work as well. And that's because it raises students' awareness of their own learning and also abilities, what they can do. It also gives them the opportunity for a reality check, so they can check whether their understanding of whether they did good, they did well on the task is actually the case, like Joni was saying. And also, it helps them become an autonomous learner in the longer term. And now, I want to hear your ideas. So peer feedback, if teacher feedback and self-reflection kind of feedback, if they have the purposes that we just talked about, what kind of roles or purposes do you think peer feedback has? And we started talking about this already, so you can just shout it out. Why do we want to do peer evaluation? Why do we want the students to give feedback to each other?
It's just another set of eyes.
Right, yeah. Just another set of eyes, yeah. So maybe if it's just the student themselves and the teacher, it's just 2 points of views, but 3 points or more actually, multiple points of views, yeah. Any? Let's work for us. No, that's a very important important point, yes, exactly. Anything else?
It helps them regurgitate the criteria of somebody else and allows them to retain the learning better.
Oh, nice.
Responsabilization. They've got responsibility in their learning, their improvement too.
Right, okay. Right. So they will be more responsible for their own learning and each other's learnings, yeah. So you covered many of them. Okay, so basically one idea is it provides the opportunity for lower kind of stake feedback before the actual performance, right? So before, maybe when they're writing a report, they can give each other feedback before they turn it in for a grade, right? Then it's a lower kind of lower stake feedback, so they don't have to worry too much about it, and they can help each other. It also raises teachers' awareness of different aspects of the performance. So if it's a group work, we don't necessarily know how they prepared, whether they divided the work equally, and we can find that out by having them peer evaluate. And lastly, like Joni said, it really helps teachers to deal with a larger kind of classroom. Yeah. So if we just, so here we have, I don't know, about 30 people. And if I have to give grades to all of you, it's really hard. But if I just have to give grades for each group, like Joni does in his classroom, it's less work, and they can, evaluate each other within each group. And lastly, just to sort of think about what kind of a role a visitor or expert other might have. So it really makes the task more authentic, real, and higher in stakes, just like in the real world. And it helps students move from a student mode to a professional mode. And if in a language classroom, they think that they are a language learner in the classroom, but by having an expert other in the classroom, they think that they are an actual user of the language, right? And lastly, it keeps the task real for the teacher as well. So that's a scary and also helpful, interesting part. And in this, I keep coming back to my own example, but so this is another, university, so it was okay for me to have a visitor in my class. So I actually invited somebody who's involved in business for when the students gave their presentations. And I just wanted to share with you one email message that my student spontaneously wrote to him. So he said, "Thank you for attending and giving valuable advice to us in class. I'm glad we had a chance to receive ideas of businessman who has a different perspective from the students." So here, you can see the kind of different kind of learning or realization that happened by having just a different outsider in the classroom. So then, just to summarize, we want to using various types of assessment provides more opportunities, more different kind of opportunities for learning and makes the assessment activity fairer. Okay. Then, just as a last sort of note, so feedback, we can give students feedback, but that's not the only thing about feedback, right? So we ourselves, the teachers, can get feedback from various activities that we do in the class and various activities that we have talked about today. So there are things that we want to, ask ourselves. So is the target task appropriate for my students? Is my assessment rubric working? Is my teaching working? And also, what do I need to improve on to foster students learning further? And maybe partially, but the kind of assessment activities that we do in the classroom can help us understand and answer and find answers to these questions. And I think that's it from me. Thank you very much, and I would like to invite you to ask any questions, any discussion questions that you would like to discuss with your colleagues. And thank you.